Welcome to Casual Friday. I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. I also upload a weekly technique video every Tuesday. And for both videos, if you'd like to jump right from one point in the video to another, either to rewatch something or to skip ahead, there are always direct links down in the description, so you can do that. So this week I want to talk about Finish It February, which starts tomorrow. I want to talk a bit about the mittens that I'm knitting for the International Wolf Center's silent auction. And then I want to talk about my vintage Roaring 20s sweater project that I cast on for this week. So let's get started. Oh, but first I wanted to share two things that came across my feed this week. First, there is a study being done at the University of Reading in England called, I think they're calling it Science Not Fluff. And it's about the effect that crochet and knitting can have on psychological well-being. So there's this questionnaire that it's like 10-15 minutes it takes to do it. And I did it. Like most questionnaires, there are some questions where you have no answer, and there's no way to give feedback about some of the questions, or to say I'm not sure or whatever. So there's going to be some of the questions where you might be like, what are they even talking about? But I didn't think it was too bad. At the end of the survey, you have the opportunity to play this game, and I think it's kind of to test your ability to focus and pay attention. That's what it seems to me what they're focusing on, because it gets pretty tedious after a while, and it's easy to let your mind wander. And you can only do that aspect of it if you are on an actual computer, not a mobile device. But you can do the survey or questionnaire, I think, on a mobile device, a tablet, phone, whatever, or computer. And then they have this game that you can play. And if you live in England, they have other chances of, if you play that game, and then you can be entered in an opportunity to win, Amazon gift card or something like that. And then there is an additional opportunity, if you live in England, that you can actually go to the university, and they can do a scan. They can scan your brain while you're crocheting or knitting, which I think could be really interesting. And again, I can't do that part of it because I don't live there. If you live in England, you might be interested in that. No matter where you live, you could take part in that questionnaire. So leave a link down below with information about how to take part in that. The second thing that came across my feed was about a TV show that's going to start on the BBC on February 6th. And again, I don't know how I'm going to be able to see that and when I'll be able to see that, but it looked really interesting to me. It's called V&A Secrets of the Museum. So it's about the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they focus in each episode apparently either on one item. They're saying the focus is supposed to be the objects, but there are going to be quite a few things that are textile related that might be really interesting to see. One of the things that I didn't realize until I went to the V&A maybe 15 years ago, our family was in England, and I left in the early morning one day to get to the V&A when it opened, because I wanted to see their collection of really old knitted items that I'd seen on my computer, and that was 15 years ago, so the computer resolution wasn't great. And they had these really old knitted items in their collection, and I was just dying to be able to see them. So I went into the museum. I went up to that part of the museum where I thought those items would be, and I couldn't find them anywhere. And I was looking and looking and looking, and I finally asked one of the employees at the museum, "Where are these things? I can't find them." And they said, "Oh, well, they're probably in storage. We only have about 10% of our collection is on exhibit at any given time." And I was like, what? That had never occurred to me that everything they had wouldn't be on display. And it's true for most museums. They have a very small percentage of their items are on display. And sometimes they're rotating things out, and sometimes things just are never on display. It's just that the museum is taking care of curating it and archiving it and preserving it, but it's not necessarily something that would be on display to the public. But the V&A always has really cool textile related things and fashion displays and exhibits and stuff in their museum. So I think this show could be really interesting. So again, I'll leave a link down to an article that I read about the program. Tomorrow is February 1st, which means it is the start of Finish It February. I've talked about this for the past couple of weeks, and I've done Finish It February for the past couple of years, but I just want to reiterate some of the key points of doing a Finish It February in case you've been reluctant to join in on it, or in case you have never heard of it before. So Finish It February is a way to pull out all of your UFOs, your unfinished objects, and kind of give them an evaluation. Is this something that I actually want to complete? Or is it something I'm done with and I'm never going to complete it? If you've been knitting for any number of years, you probably have a few projects that are many years old, and you just kind of carried them along, and someday you'll get to it, someday you'll get to it. And so this is the year where, this is the time of year where you can, be honest with yourself about whether or not you actually want to complete this thing, or if what you've done is as much as you ever care to do on it. So some people can have a real difficulty with letting go of an unfinished project because they look at it and what they see are all of the hours that they've invested in that project. And what you need to do when you are evaluating a project is consider the number of hours that you will need to invest in order to finish it. Because the number of hours that you've spent on it already are spent, whether you finish this project or not. You're not ever going to get those back. So think about whether or not you want to spend any more time on it. If the answer is no, then you're done with it, and then you make a decision about what to do with it. One thing could be you hate it so much, you would never use it, you just can't stand the sight of it, and you just throw it away. But another response might be, well, the yarn is nice and I could reuse the yarn. So I personally don't actually frog these projects that I have decided that I'm done with. What I do is they come out of the UFO pile. They're no longer any sort of work in progress. They're never going to be a finished object. And I return the unfinished thing to my yarn stash. It becomes available for yarn. This can help in a couple of ways. Number one, you're not spending any more time on this project right now because it takes time to frog a project and rewind the yarn. So you don't have to spend any more time on it right now. But the other thing that it does is it helps you deal with that idea of losing your work. That watching all of that, that work become just a mess of frogged yarn can really feel like all of that work disappeared. So what I like to do is just return it to my stash, and then at some point in the future, if I decide I want to use that yarn for something, I'll be enthusiastic about frogging it at that time and preparing it for use in this new project. But there is another option, which is that you can just knit from that unfinished object. So you only are ripping out a couple of rows at a time in order to knit with the yarn at that point. That way you never have to rewind it into a ball. It will be kinky as you're knitting with it. That can wash and block out without a problem. That eliminates the issue of having to make your work disappear into nothingness. So psychologically, that can help overcome that hurdle. So I'd encourage you to pull out all of your unfinished objects and just make a decision about what is the future of this project. And hopefully you'll be able to reduce your UFO pile and make room for more works in progress. So my projects that I'm redoing are a pillow, which I knit the two pieces and they are not the same size. They're different stitch patterns, and I need to re-knit one of the faces of the pillow and then complete it. The other thing that I am going to finish is I had a goal this year to spin 15 minutes every day just to build up the habit of spinning and using my spinning wheel on a daily basis. And I was doing that, and then as I was going through all of my yarn here in my office, I needed to move some furniture out of here in order to give myself some floor space. And I blocked my path to my spinning wheel. So I stopped spinning for about a week, and I got out of that habit. So one of the things I want to do for Finish It February is I had started spinning this green fiber that I had dyed about 1.5 years ago. So I want to finish spinning that fiber, and then I want to knit it into a hat. So those are my two Finish It February projects. One is to reknit half of a pillow, and the other is to finish spinning my green fiber and then turn it into something. So I think for my spinning, I need to have a project in mind. I can't just say I'm going to spin and just go in there randomly spin with no purpose. So I want to try to come up with some small projects throughout the year that I can see the spinning all the way through and then make them into something at the end. So hopefully I'll be able to continue with that. So last week I was telling you about these mittens that I was knitting. I just knit the hand of them. I haven't knit the cuff. I started with a provisional cast on. So I knit the second mitten yesterday, and there's a little secret message that's knitted in bumps on the side, and it's the Braille letters for wolf, W-O-L-F. I got that idea from that Magic Motifs book that I told you all about earlier in January. So tomorrow I'm going to the textile center, and when I'm there I'll get the yarn. It's a novelty yarn that was hand spun with some of this wolf fur, and I'll be using that to knit the cuffs in some way. I've got a few ideas. I was asking for ideas last week about how, I just want a bunch of ideas so that when I see the yarn and see what the qualities are of it, I can choose which idea is going to work best. I don't get to just pick up the yarn and leave with it. I use it while I am there under their supervision. I hand them any leftovers of the yarn plus the mittens will go to, will stay there with me. That's the only amount of time I have is those 4 hours. That's why the mittens have to be knit ahead of time. And I don't get to bring them home. I don't get to tweak with them. I don't get to experiment and try this and that and the other thing. I have to go there, execute my idea, and then leave the mittens there. So I have a couple of ideas. Somebody left an idea this morning, and she says, I can't remember what it's called. I think it starts with a W. And I thought, what? And she said, it's pretty stretchy. I don't know if it'll work. And I thought, oh, she's probably talking about welts. And I thought, oh, that could work. That could work, potentially. If the yarn thickness is very similar to the yarn that I created by using 2 strands of this Aran yarn to make this kind of super bulky yarn. If the wolf yarn is similar in yarn weight, that could potentially work. Another idea I have is, I have 2 ideas that involve actually knitting a ribbed cuff ahead of time and keeping it the stitches live, and then either knitting a garter stitch cuff out of the wolf fur that would flip over the rib. So I'd have, ribbing right here, and then I'd have a outer garter stitch cuff in the wolf fur. That's one idea. Potentially, another idea that I have is a cuff maybe in stockinette stitch, could be in garter stitch, and then ending it with a Latvian braid that uses this purple yarn in combination with the wolf yarn. But again, it's going to depend on whether those 2 yarns are compatible for being used together. So I wanted to have an idea where I use just the wolf yarn. Once I find out what gauge that's worked at, how many stitches I might need for that, and what needle size I'd need to use for that. Something where I just add on the wolf fur, and then some ideas where I could use them in combination. So tonight I'll do some ribbing, and it could be maybe those welts would work, and I could rip the ribbing back and just reknit them. But if I'm going to need to just knit this wolf fur cuff at the end, then I want to have a ribbed cuff to begin with, because I want something that actually functions as a decent mitten and not just something that has like a big bulky mitten with a weird short little cuff at the end. I don't want to do that. I will definitely take pictures and hopefully some video tomorrow when I'm there, so you can see what ideas the other people came up with as well. So last week I described a formula that you can use when you want to combine two strands of yarn together. And I gave a formula for how to calculate what the new gauge of the combined yarns would be. And that formula was to add the two gauges together and then divide by 3. So for this, I was using an Aran weight yarn for these mittens, but I was using 2 strands of it. So the gauge of a single strand was 4 stitches per inch. So I add those together, that's 9 stitches per inch, and I divide by 3. And that gave me 3 stitches per inch. So that was kind of the approximate ballpark gauge that I was looking for. And then I had to find a needle that would get me that gauge. And then I had to decide, do I actually like the fabric that was created by that? So that's all part of that process. Well, on Tuesday, my Technique Tuesday video was the first in a series of videos on gauge. And in that video, I was showing you that, as you use a larger and larger needle for any given yarn, that the fabric gets looser and looser. And one of the things that I was showing was that if the needle that I would normally use, say with worsted weight yarn, was a size 7 needle and it would give me 5 stitches per inch, I would still get 5 stitches per inch with a size 7 needle if I used a yarn that was thinner than that. The fabric would not have the same qualities. It would be looser and floppier. And so the bigger the needle is in relation to the thickness of the yarn, then the floppier the fabric's going to get. And in the other direction, the thinner the needle is for a given yarn, the thicker and the fabric is going to be. But when you are using a yarn that's thinner than the one you typically use for that needle, you can always get the same gauge, but that fabric is going to be very, very different. So there is a situation in which you can combine yarns and it doesn't change the gauge and you don't need to change your needle size. And that is if you are doing something like combining a mohair yarn with a regular yarn, like a standard yarn. And the reason is because mohair has a very different structure than a standard yarn that you might think of. If you were imagining yarn, you might be thinking of a standard yarn that has 3 or 4 plies, smooth, and can be used to knit a wide variety of projects. But mohair is a very different construction. So this is a little ball of Kid Silk mohair. It's called Kid Silk Haze. It's by Rowan. It's basically like a hairy thread. There's this tiny, tiny thread in there that's got all these hairs coming out of it. And if you were looking at that tiny, tiny thread and you were trying to imagine, oh my gosh, what size needle would I have to use to knit something that was that skinny? The answer is a needle that's much larger than you would imagine. In fact, this yarn can be knit to the same gauge as the single strand of this purple yarn that I was using for the wolf mitts. This is an Aran weight yarn and you can knit this at an Aran weight gauge. And what happens is that, and it's not floppy the way a regular plied yarn would be that you knit on a much larger needle. And that's because all these hairs that stick out kind of fill in those spaces and provide the structure to the fabric. So you have something that's very airy and loose looking, and yet it holds its shape. And it doesn't weigh very much. So you can have something that's big in size, but it's not going to weigh very much and it's not going to distort out of shape. The construction of the yarn can make a difference in the size of the needle that you're going to use, and it will make a difference in the kind of yardage that you get as well. The sweater that I'm wearing right here was made with a bulky weight yarn from Barocco. I can't remember the name of the type of yarn. I'll put it on the screen. And I remember when I found the pattern for this yarn that called for the pattern for this sweater that called for this yarn, I was very confused by the information about the yarn because the yardage per skein seemed like similar to a regular worsted weight yarn. The gauge though was a bulky weight gauge and the needle was larger than you'd normally use to get a bulky weight gauge. I was very confused. And so I looked the yarn up on Ravelry and I saw that it was a bulky weight yarn and it had a chainette construction. So it wasn't a regular plied yarn. It had this chainette construction. It's kind of like a miniature I-cord. And it's got a lot of air in it, and it's very stretchy. And so you can get twice as many yards in 100 grams of that kind of a construction than you can from a regular plied yarn, which is much denser. So the result was, and the reason that the needle needed to be larger is because of that extra stretch, that you use the larger needle to kind of form that stitch that's basically being stretched around the needle, and then when it comes off the needle, it's going to shrink down and relax and be a normal size that you would use for, say, a 10.5 needle instead of an 11. So I needed all of those pieces of information to understand what was going on, and I decided that I was going to use the yarn they called for in the pattern. And I was really glad. I learned a lot about this yarn. So this is a sweater made from a bulky weight yarn, and it's very warm because there's so much air in the yarn. It's really warm, and it's really light. It doesn't weigh very much. I could have knit this with a standard bulky weight yarn that had the standard 3 or 4 plies in it, and it would have been a denser yarn, and that sweater would have weighed twice as much. When you're using yarns that are a different construction than a standard ply yarn, sometimes the appearance of the yarn or the needle size that you need to use for that yarn is not going to be what you might normally expect. If you want to combine a regular plied yarn with a strand of, say, kid silk mohair, you don't have to take into account the gauge that this is typically knit at. You don't include that gauge at all. You'd just combine it with whatever other yarn you were going to knit with it, and you'd use the same needle size, and you'd get the same number of stitches per inch that you would use if you weren't including this yarn in it. So last week I was struggling with the crochet gauge for my vintage project. So I need to make these little crochet squares to form the collar of this sweater, and then also I'm going to knit, I keep saying knit, crochet these strips that become the cuff of the sweater as well. And so there are a very specific number of stitches and rows that are called for, which indicates to me that the designer had in mind a very specific gauge and a type of fabric that she was creating to make those collars and cuffs. And so I wanted to understand what her intent was. So I got a lot of advice for how to figure out the size of those squares, because that was one of the things I was puzzling about, what the size of those squares was. And once I figured, once I knew that, I was getting a lot of advice about, well, what to do to just get a square that was that size that was crocheted. And I really appreciate that advice, but I think I either wasn't making clear or my goals are just so different. When I pick out a vintage project to knit, I'm not looking at it and saying, oh, I like that sweater. I want to make a sweater that looks like that. I'm looking at it in terms of how it was constructed and what is unusual about that construction compared to what you see in contemporary patterns. But most of all, I'm looking to learn something. A lot of things, hopefully. I want to learn how they're using techniques differently than we might use them today. It might be the same techniques that we use today, but in a different way. And I want to try those techniques in the way that they're using them in those old patterns to see if I can figure out why they were used that way. My goal for the crochet, understanding the crochet, was not to end up with the right size square. Yes, I want to end up with the right size square. I wanted to understand what that fabric was actually like, and I wanted to figure out how to create that fabric. And I knew that I was missing some puzzle pieces. I mean, that's part of the fun of a vintage project too, is that you have a few of the puzzle pieces, and then you have a few pieces that you're really not quite sure about. They're either missing or you don't understand how to look at them. So my sweater told me what yarn to use. It's called a Corticelli Floss Ola, and the description of it is that it's identical to imported Shetland floss. And the pattern calls for it to be worked at 5 stitches per inch. And so I look at that gauge and I think that's a worsted weight yarn gauge. And so I ordered a worsted weight yarn. A couple of people have noted that, geez, that fabric seems to have more drape to it than I would expect in a worsted weight yarn. Are you sure about that yarn weight? And I'm like, no, I can only tell you what the gauge was. I don't really understand what the yarn is. If you look up Shetland floss on vintage yarn charts, I've seen some charts where they have them sort of in order by starting at the thinnest and going up to the thickest and describing what yarn weight they are in today's terms. And that's one of the confusing things about the Shetland floss, is that it often ends up in some really thin yarn weight description area. Calling it something like a fingering weight yarn or sport weight yarn doesn't really give you all the information you need. And so there's some speculation in the vintage, all things vintage group that perhaps Shetland floss was different yarn weights at different times or by different companies, that it could be varying. It was really a description of what the yarn was like. We just don't know, because we don't have something today that is the same, that we would be able to identify as being the same. So some people were suggesting, well, maybe it's really a finer yarn weight. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to knit a sweater with like a fingering weight yarn. It's 5 stitches per inch. It's just not, it's going to have all this drape. It's going to stretch out of shape. That doesn't make sense. So I was struggling with the crochet gauge, and I cast on for the sweater this past weekend. And one of the things that the sweater calls for, the very first instruction, is to use 2 strands of the yarn, cast on the number of stitches, and then it says to knit 10 ribs. And then after that, it says to start working in Spalding stitch, which was stockinette stitch for the sweater body. At no point does it say to eliminate the second strand. It doesn't say anything about that. But if you look at other sweaters made with that yarn in the same booklet, you can see that they also call for casting on with 2 strands of yarn for the garter stitch border. And then they tell you specifically to use those 2 strands only for the garter stitch, and then to cut one of them. So there is a missing instruction from that, is what I got from that. But as I've shown with my wolf mittens, when you combine 2 strands together, it creates a thicker yarn. So what I didn't know was why they were calling for 2 strands. I knew that it would create a denser fabric than 1 strand would, but I didn't know why they wanted to do that. Normally I wouldn't want something that was that much denser, but I thought I'm gonna try and see what happens. Well, if I use the same needle size as I was going to use for the rest of the sweater, and I use 2 strands, I can't get the same gauge. The stitches are bigger because you just can't cram the yarn into those kinds of spaces. So I knew that I would either need to reduce the number of stitches or reduce the needle size, and it didn't mention that anywhere in the pattern that you'd need to do that. I went ahead and I cast on with a needle 2 sizes smaller, and I knit the garter stitch hem, and it was really difficult to do, and it's really dense fabric. And I was planning on, well, what am I going to do if I decide later that I only want it to have 1 strand? Like how could I snip it out and then reknit it in the opposite direction once? You know, it's coming up with a game plan for how to redo that hem if I needed to. So I was doing that, and I was thinking about the crochet gauge, and I went back and I reread the description of Shetland floss. And it says it's used for lightweight sweaters, and that it's a hairy yarn. And so I was reading that, and I was thinking, okay, well, what do they mean by lightweight sweater? And then it said that it was a hairy yarn. And I started thinking a little bit about how mohair is so hairy. It's a very thin looking yarn, but that hair in between the stitches provides that structure. And I realized that this yarn is a hairy yarn. I don't know what it looked like. I don't know if it had like 2 plies. I don't know what it looked like. But it's clear that it was a thinner yarn, but it had hair to it that provided the structure, and that the reason that you'd want 2 strands of it for the hem was to provide some density. and that it would be easy to do that. You could combine 2 strands of it and it wouldn't affect gauge. You'd be able to use the same needle size. And it also meant that you'd be able to use a much smaller crochet hook and crochet those little squares to a much smaller gauge. So that finally all of the pieces of the puzzle fit together, because the yarn I selected is meant to be worked at 5 stitches per inch, but it is a denser yarn that has more fiber per yard than this Shetland floss, whatever it is, probably had. I'm not worried about it in terms of the body of the sweater, but it does give me some direction to go in terms of the hem of the sweater. So I ripped it out and I reknit it with 1 strand because that's plenty dense enough. It gives me the kind of hem I need for this sweater with this kind of yarn. But what it told me that I should do or could do or experiment with for the crocheted bits was to unply the yarn. I took a small amount of the yarn and I ran it into my spinning wheel so that I would take the twist out. So, and then I took the end and I divided. I have 2 plies in one hand and 2 plies in the other. And then I wound those off of my spinning wheel. So I created 2 little balls of yarn that were each 2 plies. And I tried crocheting with that, tried a couple of different crochet hooks for that. And then I'm doing another experiment where I just take one of the plies, one of the 4 plies out, and I crocheted with 3 plies. So I'm trying to decide which one of those I'm going to use, 2 plies or 3 plies to create these little squares. And there's no problem crocheting at that finer gauge when I've removed some of the plies. So this is the kind of thing that I'm trying to learn from doing these vintage projects, is not to get a 2-inch square that I can use for my my crochet collar, but to figure out what materials that the designer was using, and so therefore what kind of fabric did she have to work with, and how did all of those work together. So that's my goal. And so now I know more about what Shetland floss probably was like, and I think the sweater will still come out okay, but at least I'll have those little squares will be in a kind of fabric that makes more sense than trying to use my 4-ply worsted weight yarn and crocheting at a tiny gauge, or trying to crochet it at a larger gauge, giving it chunkier stitches and a thicker fabric, which I don't particularly want. So these are the kinds of things. This is the reason I'm knitting this particular vintage pattern. It's one of the reasons I chose this, is because I don't know a lot about crochet and I wanted to learn more, but I also just wanted to understand this whole process. So I'll show you what I've got so far. I've got a fair amount of the sweater done. I've got 3 of the motifs done so far. I've got 2 more to do for the body. I've got a yellow triangle and then another blue V, and then I'll be casting on a ton of stitches for the underarm. And at some point, probably when I start that blue V, I'm going to be doing like a little gusset of some sort. I'm trying to decide if I want to just knit the corners, like knit straight up and then cast on, and then figure out what size gusset I need and knit that in separately and then seam it in, or if I want to plan it as I go. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm tempted to wait and see what size I actually need. And, you know, I can do like a little diamond like they do in Fisherman Ganseys. So the color work technique that is used to create the sweater is called intarsia. And that was another thing that was missing from these instructions. It tells you how many stitches they're calling, the color they're using is sand. I'm using a color called buttercream, but they would say knit 17 stitches in sand, 1 stitch in blue, 17 sand, 1 blue. And then, so they're telling you how many stitches of each color, but they don't tell you the method of color work. I knew by looking at this that this is a color block or intarsia method of knitting, but they don't mention it. And there is another pattern in the booklet that uses intarsia where they actually describe what to do. So I thought it was interesting that this pattern was missing the information about using 2 strands for the entire hem, as well as missing the instructions for how to actually do color work. When I learned to knit in the mid-80s, oversized sweaters with color block patterns were very popular. So I did a lot of intarsia knitting back in the late 80s and early 90s. In fact, one sweater, one sweater that I knit was this one. It's actually a jacket, and it's the designer is Sasha Kagan. This is a sweater that was in her book called Big and Little Sweaters, I think. And one of the things I loved about that book, I loved all of her different intarsia patterns, but I loved that these were sweaters that were sized from little kid all the way up to large adult, and that there were, I think, 5 or 6 different types of sweaters. There was like a pullover, what we in the US would call a vest. It's a sleeveless sweater that's pullover. Or they would have like a waistcoat, which in the US we would also call a vest, but it would be a button-up vest. And then they had like pullovers with sleeves. They had cardigans, and they had jackets. I think those were all of the different things. So they had all of those different silhouettes and all of those different sizes. And I used to look through this book. I have it right here, I think. Is this book right here. And I had this book, and that sweater, that jacket that I showed you was one that I really wanted to knit. But it was one of those kinds of projects where there's so many colors, and I'm slightly colorblind. And so there's 2 problems with trying to knit a sweater that has that many colors. And one of them is finding a yarn shop that has enough colors in the types of yarn that you need. That will work together, and then the other challenge is picking those colors out and being confident that it's going to work. I have a lot of trouble with that. When I first learned to knit in Ireland, when I came back, I needed to finish my degree, and I was subletting an apartment one summer with these couple of girls. One of them was an art student, and she and 2 other art students, well, one's an architecture student, so there's another art student and an architecture student, were going to share an apartment together, and they needed one more roommate. And she got to know me over the summer. She's like, oh, we'd love to have you share this apartment with us. And so I would show them like books that I had, like Kay Fassett books, and how I just loved the way he used colors. And but it was really intimidating to me to go to a yarn shop and try to pick those colors out. And so she went to a shop with me, and she would do things like she would pull out two balls of yarn, and she'd lay one across the other and say, look how the color changes when you put them next to each other. So she was kind of showing me a little bit about color theory and how to see if colors work together or not. But I still found it super intimidating. So for my birthday that year, the 3 of them went to this yarn shop and picked out a bunch of yarns that would be enough yarn to knit a vest, a Kay Fassett vest. And so they had all the colors, and then I got to choose how and when to use each one, but I had colors that worked together, and it was like a thrill. It was like being given a kit. So I was loving those Sasha Kagan sweaters, and I could never figure out how to buy the yarn for them. I couldn't find those exact yarns that were called for in any shop. And then someone told me that there was a yarn shop downtown that was going out of business. And did I want to go? They were having a big sale. And so I went there, and it was a big yarn shop that had multiple rooms. And I was walking from one, and there's so many people, and I was like, oh. And I was walking from room to room, and there, as I was about to walk out of one room into another, on the floor was a box that was a kit for the Sasha Kagan sweater in the exact colorway and the poppy sweater that I wanted. And I was like, ah! And I think it might have been 50% off or something. And I bought it. I would take my knitting to work with me. And so at lunchtime, I'd eat my lunch, take 15 minutes to eat my lunch, and then I'd sit there talking to people while I knit. And so I would take this project to work, and I would be knitting it. And then I'd go home at night, and I'd knit some more. And I started seeing all of these yarn tails accumulating on the inside of the sweater. And I also had some trouble at lunch, like keeping track of where I was in the chart while also conversing. And so what I figured out was I'd take the sweater to work at lunch, talk to people, and I would just weave in ends in my lunch hour, and then I'd go home in the evenings and I would knit some more on this, because there were sometimes I had 30 or 40 color changes when I worked across a row on the back of the sweater. That's a lot of ends to try to deal with at the end of a project. So one of the things I was doing as I was creating my spreadsheet for this project, like I always do, create and counting up the total number of stitches and figuring out different things like where I was going to do shaping, you know, to add for the underarm, or making notes about stop here and do this. I thought, oh, I should count up how many yarn tails there are going to be and have a plan for dealing with the yarn tails. And so I did a really rough count of them, and I realized there were going to be more than 500 yarn tails for the sweater. And I just kind of like, oh no. So what I decided to do was, you know, as I finish each one of these blocks that have the color in them, I weave in the tails on the back. And that does two things. First of all, it reduces the number of tails I'm going to have to weave in at the very end of the project. But the other thing it does is, you can see that when I was knitting this black section, you see how I have these yarn tails that are hanging down. I haven't woven in yet. If I were to start the next color section, I'm going to have little balls of yarn hanging off the back of my work, and they're going to tangle around each other as it is, and then they're also going to tangle around these tails, and it gets to be a real pain. So it's just better to deal with the tails as I go. It's just something I've learned from Intarsha projects in the past. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you'd like to join in on Finish It February and get some encouragement and let us know what you've found in your pile of UFOs, I'll leave a link to the Ravelry thread down in the description, and you can join in the fun. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.